All right, so let's talk about Angular. So Angular is a single-page application framework that enforces certain design patterns that have become very popular on the middle tier for quite a while. Right? So for instance, the model view controller design pattern has been around for at least 2 decades, and it became very, very popular on the server side. And it's very, very mature in these other frameworks such as J2EE and .NET. Okay, and a lot of the lessons that we learned in those types of applications, we are going to reuse a lot of those same ideas, but now they're moving towards being applied on the front end. Okay, these design patterns grew up from the need of building really complex, large, scalable, reusable applications, and now we find ourselves having to apply similar ideas in JavaScript. JavaScript used to not be that important, but now that a lot of we're building very responsive, very single-page applications that are fairly large, we need to deal with this complexity. So we are copying or reusing a lot of the ideas that we use to approach large applications on the server side. We are reapplying them now on the client side. Okay, such as we're heavily going to be using the model view controller, inversion of control, injection, decorators. So all these ideas have been around for a while on the middle tier, and now we're going to be applying them on the client side. Okay, so Angular it's a component-based framework, very much like React. So we'll keep the same jargon, right, of components, although it enforces a little more structure than React. React is strictly for rendering, right? It's you have a lot of embedded JavaScript with HTML, and you compute content right inside of your JavaScript, right? And JSX makes it very easy to intersperse HTML alongside with JavaScript. Whereas Angular takes a more of a structured approach, right? And says, well, no, let's divide those roles into specific concerns, right? So for instance, the concern of rendering something for the user should not be the responsibility of anything but the view. There should be a view artifact, right? Some HTML page that will handle all that has to do with rendering, right? The JavaScript side will handle anything that has to do about logic, right? About handling events, fetching data, massaging data, responding to logic in the application. So you won't see any HTML interspersed with JavaScript, right? There's a very clear delineation between these two worlds. That the only way that these worlds would talk to one another is by sending each other messages or sending each other objects or data, right? But the HTML would never see JavaScript, and JavaScript would never see HTML, right? There's a clear division between those two, right? Same thing with data access. Typically, we want to encapsulate, and we applied some of these division of concerns in React. We designed singleton services to handle data access, right? So same thing here, but Angular makes it explicit, right? We're going to create services that can be injected using inversion of control, so some of these ideas are much more formal than you have in React. And some folks feel that this is a little bit too constrictive, right? That it forces you to implement certain things in a particular pattern, right? And you can't deviate from that pattern, right? Some folks find that somewhat restrictive. So, all right, so let's get started. So the first part will be to install an Angular command line interface, just like we did for React, right? Just like we have a create React application, we will have a command line interface for Angular. And you install it by using npm. So you'll need to have latest version of Node. So you'll node install Angular /CLI, so the command line interface. that installs an executable on your path called ng. Right? So you say ng, and then you can use it to create applications, right? Like for instance, ng new, and then a hello world app. And then you can then go into that directory, and then you can just start it. You can say ng serve. ng serve will start a local server that will listen for changes in your files, will recompile and redeploy locally on your machine. -- open will automatically open your application in a local browser. You can still also just use npm start. That works as well. Okay, that's basically what ng serve does. ng serve calls npm start, right, and then starts up a local browser. And then you can go and navigate to your local application at 4200, localhost 4200. Right, so React uses 3000, Angular uses 4200. Right, but that's only locally. Right, that's irrelevant when you deploy this on a hosted environment. You can change the port if you don't want to use 4200. You can set it as an argument 4300 or whatever. Okay. All right. So now internally you can create components by hand. Components is it will be an encapsulation of several concepts. The encapsulation of some logic implemented in JavaScript that will handle events that are sent over from a user as they click and type or drag or whatever, as they interact with the user interface. That will generate a stream of events, right, that will be handled by a component. And the component's responsibility will be to fetch data, massage data, handle these events, and provide data for rendering to a template. And a template is an HTML file that is meant to be part of a component. Right? So a component has 3 parts. Right? It has the logic part, which is the component per se, the HTML part, which is the template, right? And there will be a styling that goes along with that. So there'll be at least 3 files for every component. Right? We'll have the TS file, which is not JavaScript, is TypeScript. TypeScript is it's a superset of JavaScript. It's like a better JavaScript, right? It's what JavaScript should have been all along. A plain old JavaScript file is also a TypeScript file because it's a subset of the TypeScript language. But TypeScript brings about a lot of modern ideas that have been lacking for quite a while in JavaScript, like data types, strong typing. Now it's going to be available here. Inheritance and interfaces and things that we take for granted in the object-oriented world, and we were hoping for them to be here. Now they are. TypeScript implements all those object-oriented ideas that we've come to love in other languages. So anyway, so we'll be working on TypeScript. It looks very, very similar to JavaScript. So here's our very first components. We can either do it from our IDE TypeScript file, a brand new TypeScript file, and we could say hello world dot components. And let's actually do it. So let's create a new client. So this will be, let's see, where are we? No, not experiments. Right, so we had created this application, the webdev summer 1 2018. So let's create an Angular client. Right, this will be the application that the students will use. Right, they'll log into this application, right, and they'll be able to consume content. Right, so let's create a brand new application here. So it'll be ng new. So we'll call this webdev summer 1 2018. And just so that we distinguish it from our React version, we'll put Angular next to it, Angular. And so that I know it's mine and not yours, right, I'll put my username. Oops. Janunzi start new names must start with a letter. They do. Okay. Oh no dashes. Okay. Really? Does it say what? Only alphanumeric or oh, it's okay for dashes. Is it too long? New pronoun must start with a letter and must contain only alphanumeric or dashes.
Oh, so the 2 in 2018 is invalid. You need to put a letter.
Right, because it maps it to folders. All right, so while that is being created, let's see, where are we? Oops. Right, so we can create components from scratch, like so, or we can use one of the ng's commands that will allow us to generate components, some boilerplate components. Inside, you create components by just creating a class. So that's such, very much like React. So I would say export class in the name of the class, and you load components very much like React, right? It says you import components from Angular core, and then you can decorate your class with decorator, with a component decorator. Those of you who have done Java, or we've done it in our JPA, right? When we decorate things as a REST controller or as a CRUD repository, same thing. So we're borrowing that same syntax, right? Those same ideas. We're borrowing it and applying it here with TypeScript. So we're decorating this as a component, as opposed to perhaps extending the component class. We're decorating it. And this decorator, we can configure certain things. For instance, we can configure what is the tag, right, that we want to use to be able to render this on an HTML page, right? In React, the file name was based off of the name of the class, right? It gave you the name of the tag, which you can override. Here you override it as a configuration object inside of the component. Right, so if you want to render whatever this component represents, you would use less than and greater than and that tag name. Yes. Also, by default, it prepends an identifier, right? That typically would be based off of whatever organization you're working for, right? They'll have an acronym that is based off of your particular company, right? So it automatically prepends here an identifier. The default identifier is app, right? So the actual tag name will be app hello-world, right? And we'll see that in a minute. So that's the default tagging name. You can also put in here the HTML that will be rendered. You can either hard code it right here in the component and give it an HTML snippet, or better yet, you can actually refer to a file, right? So you can give it a template URL and tell it what file has my HTML, right? And use that instead, right? If this is more than one line of HTML, you can escape it by putting a backward quote, and you can have multiple lines of HTML. Right? Not that you would want to do that, but you can. Right? You can escape lots and lots of HTML in a single entry point in template. So we're not going to be using this implementation of using template. Instead, we're going to be using template URL and pointing it to a separate file. Right? So and typically the naming convention is that if this is called hello world.ts, the HTML will be called hello world.html. Right? So we'll be following that naming convention. And if it has a style sheet that goes along with it, there'll be a hello world.css that goes along with it, right? And if there's a unit test, right, that goes along with this, it'll also be called hello world.spec or whatever, right, or .test. Okay? So it'll be a naming convention that goes along with each single component. And a component is meant to be one particular representation in some user interface, right? That can be rendered as a tag. All right, so once you've declared your components, that's the most trivial component, okay, that just renders hello world. You need to declare it. Now, the Angular provides a configuration module called the app.module.ts, okay? And that is what gets loaded and bootstraps the entire application, gets everything running. Okay, it registers all the components. It registers any data providers. Here, we're just declaring our brand new component we just created in declarations. So you need to import your brand new component, and you declare it in your declarations. Now, once we use the ng tool, right, to generate our components, this will be done for you automatically. All right, you won't have to do this by hand. Right, it will create the components. It will create all 4 files: an HTML file, a TS file, a style sheet, a spec file, right, and will automatically register it here in modules. So you won't have to do that by hand. Right. Once you have that, we can override. We can throw away the original app rendering. When you start up your application, the very first thing, this is what it displays, right? Actually, let's see if our application is done. Okay, so it's done. We can go in there. WebDev 2000 Angular, and we can say npm start. Oops. Apparently, I already have something running. Oh, there it is. Okay, so it's compiling. What it's doing is that it's taking the TypeScript language, all our code written in TypeScript. Since browsers don't know how to interpret JavaScript, what it's doing is it's transpiling, right? It's compiling our TypeScript into a lower version, right, in JavaScript, so that browsers can actually understand. Right? So it's very much similar to what React was doing, right? It was transpiling it and converting it into an equivalent JavaScript. Okay, so it's up and running, and so we can hit our localhost 4200. Right, and this is the default application that appears. Okay, and what we want to do is just throw this away, right? Throw away the default and substitute it with our own actual content. And that happens in the actually, let's open it up. Say open, and this is under WebDev 2018 and Angular. Okay, there it is. So all our code is under source app. All right. There's our app.module. That's where we're going to be declaring some of our components are going to be listed in here. Any data services are going to be listed here. Here's our default component. This is the default content right now. It says welcome to title. And there are 3 links. And here are some links to help you get started. And that's exactly the content we're looking at right now. Okay, this is the welcome to app. Yes? This is the content we're looking at. And we can just throw that away. Right, we just say h1 hello. And notice that it compiles immediately. It compiles immediately and refreshes the browser. Yeah, so we want to replace this with components that we're going to be building throughout the rest of the semester. So let's take a look at some simple implementations here, some simple examples. Where is my? Oh, there it is. Where was I? Let's see. Hello world. Right. So if we render it, it'll look something like this: "Hello world," and it renders. Right. So let's actually create a component. But instead of doing it manually, like we just saw, let's actually use the tool that we use to create the application in the first place, ng. All right. So instead of us creating the files by hand, we're going to use ng generate component. Okay. And then the name of the component. So I'll call it hello world, not hello world 2. So here from the command line, let's see where we are. We're going to say ng generate component and hello world. And notice that it creates four entries: a CSS file, an HTML file, a spec file, and the actual component. And it updated app.module, so it registered my component right there. So you don't have to do that by hand. So if you go in there, there's my hello world directory, and in there it created the component. Right? If we open up that component, it is the simplest of components. Right? Notice that the selector, it chose app-hello-world. Right? It says that the HTML is found at hello world.component.html, which is this one right here. Okay, and right now it just says hello world works. Okay. And if we want to see it rendered, we can go to our HTML component and just throw that away and bring hello world. There it is. If we save that and we go. Notice that it re-renders and it says hello world works. Okay, so there we are in that component, and we're rendering that HTML. Everybody okay? Everybody good? All right, awesome. All right, so let's now that we have a component, let's take a look at being able to have the JavaScript side and the template side talk to one another. Right? Notice that we're not going to be mixing JavaScript with HTML. Instead, Angular makes a very, very explicit delineation between those two worlds. They should not mix. The only way that they talk to one another is sending data back and forth. Okay? So the way that happens is that any variable that you declare on the component. So if we go to the component, if I command click on a component, it takes me to the component, right? And or if I command clicked on the HTML, it goes to the HTML, right? So any variable that I declare here, and say message, hello from hello world component. Oops. Okay. Oh, it wants single quotes. So anything that I declare, any variable that I declare, is readily available in the HTML side. Right? Anything I do to that variable, the HTML gets updated. Right? And vice versa. If the HTML does anything to that variable, the controller knows it. Right, so there's a double binding between these two worlds, right? So that they can talk to one another. So if I go back to the template, the HTML, I can grab this variable, and I can paste the name of that variable, but in double curly brackets. In double curly brackets, it's an escape sequence characters, right? That says, hey, don't interpret this literally. It's not a string. It's not HTML. It's meant to be resolved, right, in some context. So somebody bound some data against that symbol, find it and render it. Yes? It's a sequence. You can change it if you don't want it. You can put some double pointy brackets, double quotes. Well, no, you'll see in a minute, but it would be just single. It would be single, yeah. That sequence. That sequence is only used when you are inlining, right? If it's not part of an outer HTML, you want to inline it along where just normal text would appear, right? You would only use that sequence, character sequence. But if instead is being fed into an expression, right, there would be no curly brackets whatsoever. Right? We'll see that in a minute. So there we are. So we're setting it, and if we make any, okay, I guess we can leave this here. Any changes that I make to that component, it readily changes on the HTML template. Okay. All right. Okay, so let's start looking at something a little more interesting. For instance, sending more complex objects, maybe like an array of objects. Okay, and let's try render maybe a list. All right. So for instance, let's declare a list of courses. Presumably, this would be a list that you fetched from some HTTP service. Yes, and now you have the data, and you want to pass it along to be rendered on the templates. So let's declare this. Let's declare maybe over here, courses. And again, in one single quotes. Really? So this is my courses. On the HTML, I can render. I can say h2 courses. Right, and I can display how many courses I have. I can say courses.length. Right, so I can use it as just a regular object. Right, I can maybe put this in parentheses. How many courses do we have? And it renders right there, courses, and then the number. Okay. Now, if we want to iterate over it, typically in React we would make an expression, we would map. Right, and as we're mapping, we're building this larger expression. Here, what Angular tried to do instead is to try to stick to HTML as much as possible. Right, try to deviate from HTML as least as possible. Okay? So here you would have a UL, and you would have a line item, and ideally this line item here would be some kind of template, right, that you might want to copy and paste many times for every instance of the objects in that array, right? So this is grabbing data from JavaScript. It's being passed as an object, which is courses in this case, and I want to kind of put this in a loop, right? Iterate this for every instance. So to accomplish that. What Angular does is that it creates all sorts of custom directives, right? That can be treated as if they were just plain old attributes. So in HTML, you have attributes such as class, right? And then you can configure the class the way it looks like. This might be a list item or whatever, or you can change the style. That you can change the background. So Angular tried to do that. It says, okay, so you already know a syntax in HTML that allows you to say what is it that you're configuring, and then the configuration. Right? What are you configuring, and then the information that means something to that configuration. Yes, a style takes a CSS expression, right? Whereas a class takes a list of strings. Right? So depending on the attribute, you pass it different things. Yes? Right? So what Angular did is that created all sorts of augmented the language. Augmented HTML says, hey, how about I give you a whole bunch of other attributes, brand new attributes, and then it'll encapsulate all sorts of behavior. Right? So for instance, one of them is the ng4 attribute. And guess what it does? It's a loop. Right? It's a for loop. The ng says that this is an Angular attribute, so that you don't confuse it with other attributes. Right? So it's clear that this is an attribute that was generated by Angular. Angular is providing this attribute. Right? And we don't call them attributes; we call them directives. Right? But a directive is something a little more generic, A directive can be triggered as an attribute. It can also be triggered as an element, an actual element, or it can be treated as a class. It can be triggered in any number of ways. But the most common way of triggering behavior of an attribute of a directive is as an attribute. Okay, it's an attribute, and you can pass it arguments. You can say equal, right? And here you can have what it accepts is an expression that it can loop over. It wants to know, what do you want me to loop over? What do you want me to iterate over? Okay, and as I iterate, I will extract each element and I'll bind it to a local variable so that you can use it. Right? So here you use a TypeScript expression where you can declare a variable. Right? So I want to let course, meaning I'm declaring a brand new variable course, and I'm grabbing each course from courses. Right? Let course of courses. Right? Plus, directives there are many types of directives. Right? Directives that are read-only, directives that can generate DOM elements, directives that can read from an input field, directives that can generate an event. Right? If you click on something, yes. So to specify what is the directive doing, whether it's generating DOM, whether it's reading from the input fields, or generating events, okay, it has its own syntax. If a directive is modifying the DOM, you put a star in front of it. So I am generating DOM. Right? I'm manipulating the DOM. Okay. So now it understands what it's doing, right? It's taking the array in courses, it's iterating over it, and it's binding every object in that array in a local variable course. Yes? And the scope of that variable is within the DOM element that you're in. Right? So that li, anything you declare inside of that li has access to that course variable you just declared. Right, notice that in the ng4 we don't have curly brackets, right? All right, no curly brackets. It understands this as being an expression, and notice that it parses it and understands it as such. So internally, we can now refer to the course. We're going to refer to the course. Let's see what that renders. Notice that it renders an object. Says it's an object. Okay, it's a complex JavaScript JSON object. Okay, I can't render it. I know it's a type object, but I can render any element, any property in that object, such as the title. I can render the titles in there. Okay, make sense? Everybody good? All right. So there it is. So the only thing that the component did was provide the data, right? Bind it to a variable. And the HTML template that goes along with that component, right? They use the same variables, right? And they can talk to one another. Make sense? Right? And there's some magic in between that's happening between those two. All right. So we have the component sending the data across to the HTML templates, right? The component is taking the role of a controller. In an MVC architecture, the component is playing the role of the controller. Right? It's in the middle between two worlds. It's between the world of the human being, right? That it's interacting, it's reading content, it's typing, just generating events, and the controller's responsibility is to handle those events, and then dispatch those events to folks that know what to do with those events. Right? Perhaps a data service that stores something in the database, some manipulation in the model. It should not be responsible for doing that. Its responsibility is to be in between two worlds, right? In the world of the human being and the world of the object-oriented world, right? Some binary representation of that world. Yes, right? So the component is taking that role, and the view, right? The HTML. Template is in the role of the view, the V in MVC, right? It should not know anything about logic. It doesn't know anything about data. It's just being sent data and is being asked to render this data, right? It should be dumb about it, right? It should only be smart about how to render it, right? How to make it look pretty, how to best render this into multiple components, okay? And Angular makes it very, very clear, very enforces this pattern very strongly. Okay, so let's keep going. Let's look at perhaps handling events.